Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Our topics for tonight are War of Terror, Scott Ritter and AIPAC, a little bit of a comparison there, and Israel's disaster. So, let's get right with it. Catherine Lewandowski is here. Hello, Catherine. Catherine 4LD39. Very nice to see you, Catherine. So there are a few other people here as well, but they haven't declared themselves yet. So I cannot greet them as I would, but you're very welcome, of course. I'm going to start by sharing a piece from Pepe Escobar, a recent piece. Title of it, I picked it up at the UN's Review, and the title of it is The Forever Wars Go Full War of Terror. He wrote this, or published it on the UN's Review today anyway, at August 10th, 2024. And the caption on that very interesting graphic, which is one of the Statue of Liberty going up in flames. So, hope we never see that happen. But of course, symbolically, or this may be true, what's happening symbolically, because there are all kinds of signs that liberty in the United States is going up in flames, even if the statue still stands on Bedloes Island in New York Harbor. Caption: both the axis of resistance and Christian Orthodox Russia need to step up the game radically, says Pepe. And he provides Exhibit A. The stunning confirmation came directly from Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Rybakov during a quite revealing interview on Rossiya TV. Foreign Minister Rybakov, extremely competent, is also the leading Russian Sherpa. Of course, Sherpa is a mountain guide in the Himalayas for BRICS Plus, preparing the summit next October in Kazan. Well, that is just a few months from now. Only 2 months from now. Essentially, Russian intel discovered that Kiev intel was setting up the joint assassination of President Putin and Defense Minister Belousov during the Navy Day parade late last month in St. Petersburg. Mr. Rybakov was very cautious, as this is a matter of national security involving several top agencies. When asked directly whether, quote, an action was being prepared at the main naval parade, unquote, against Putin, Foreign Minister Rybakov was not explicit. He only acknowledged the presence of, quote, a certain connection with this kind of event, according to the Russian Foreign Ministry. Mr. Rybakov called this provocation being prepared by Kiev a, quote, very alarming, unquote, episode, which was planned in connection, quote, with our internal events in order to inflict maximum damage and obtain the maximum media effect they need, unquote. What's intriguing is how the plot line developed. Normally, we would have had Mr. Bortnikov from the FSB, or Patrushev, special advisor to Putin, picking up the phone and calling the CIA's Burns to ask for a serious explanation. In this case, it was much more hardcore. Specifically, Belousov himself called the head of the Pentagon, weapons peddler Lloyd Raytheon, quote unquote, Austin, and told him in no uncertain terms to tighten the leash on the Kyiv goons or else. Now imagine how the transcript of the blunt Russian message would read. As Andrei Martynov remarked, Belousov must have detailed how Kyiv would simply cease to exist, and in due time, quote unquote, so would DC if the Americans decided to authorize the hit. Mr. Rybakov also referred to, quote, some other countries, unquote, who would have been part of the package. Translation, Brits and Poles. What this little story tells us is that Moscow finally seems to be getting the picture. There's no way to deal rationally with terror entities except to politely tell them in their faces that if certain conditions are fulfilled, they will be incinerated with no mercy. Okay. Exhibit B. This concerns the cosmic dementia permeating the Zionist project. Apart from the inestimable Alistair Crook, who called everyone's attention to what's really at stake, and we went over Alistair's piece earlier this week, only a few people across the collective West have any idea of the, quote, long black cloud, unquote, that may be coming down to, quote, Bob Dylan. This goes way beyond the government in Tel Aviv, quote, losing control of the extreme right, unquote. Cue to the key passages of an interview with Moshe Bogi Yalon. The Bogi is in quote, by the way. Former chief of staff of the IDF and also former defense minister. Quote from Bogi, this is, when you talk about Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they have a rabbi. His name is Dov Lior. He is the rabbi of the Jewish underground who intended to blow up the Dome of the Rock. And before that, the buses in Jerusalem. Why? In order to hurry up the last war, unquote. Translation, says Pepe. The two most extreme members of the Netanyahu cabinet, follow the same rabbi who wants to blow up Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild the Jewish temple, expel or kill all Palestinians, and prevail in a coming Armageddon. Yalon then delivers the clincher, quote, this concept rests on Jewish supremacy, Mein Kampf in reverse, unquote. In this case, quote, a war of Gog and Magog, unquote. Yalon adds, quote, this is what goes into the decision-making process in the Israeli government, unquote. The lowdown, okay, an eschatological ultra-rabid cult is dictating policy in Tel Aviv. The HQ, the headquarters of a genocidal settler colonial construct, complete with a massive vigilante militia or interlocking militias of hundreds of thousands of settlers armed to their teeth, uncontrollable and ready to do anything, even attacking the military and the Israeli state itself. There's absolutely no way to talk or to reason with this fanatic mob. they could only be dealt with in one precise way. And the fact is, the axis of resistance is not there yet. Von Kampfen reverse, says Pepe, meets the axis of resistance. Exhibits A and B taken together make the case that the empire's forever wars are metastasizing into a seamless war of terror, not war on terror, war of terror, from mini genocides within the larger genocide in Gaza to serial targeted assassinations from Beirut to Tehran to attacks on civilians from Belgorod to Kursk. For all the expectations across the global majority of having the axis of resistance severely humiliate the Talmudic psychos, as it stands, we are just witnessing the spectacle of Persians displaying their mastery of Sun Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, of course, who was a master in diplomacy. PSYOPs, strategic ambiguity, waiting game. Iran's application of Sun Tzu is faultless and is driving the Talmudic psychos and their exceptionalist enablers absolutely nuts. Meanwhile, in the Ukrainian front, a new sense of urgency may finally become inevitable. But Dmitry Medvedev, more unplugged than ever, has set the tone. From now on, it should be no holds barred. Quote, from now on, the special military operation must assume an extraterritorial character. This is no longer just an operation to return our official territories and punish the Nazis. We can and must go to the lands of the still existing Ukraine, to Odessa, to Kharkov, Donetsk, Petrovsk, to Nikolaev, to Kiev, to Kiev, and further. There should be no restrictions in the sense of some borders of the Ukrainian Reich recognized by someone. And now we can and must talk about this openly without embarrassment and diplomatic curtsies. The terrorist operation of the Banderites must remove any taboos from this topic. Let everyone, including the English bastards, realize this. We will stop only when we consider it acceptable and beneficial for ourselves, unquote. So now we're fast approaching the, quote, show me the money, unquote, cliffhanger. Both the axis of resistance and Christian Orthodox Russia need to step up the game radically. Otherwise, the intertwined wars of terror may become ominously unmanageable. A very interesting piece by Pepe here, which I think is his response to the possibility that the terror attacks in various quarters of the world may turn into a punishing regional war, in the Middle East, and an even larger scale war in the Ukraine area, with retaliations far and wide, and the possible development of World War III out of all this. This is what Pepe is saying to us, in this particular blog. And if we're wise, we will take this as a warning ourselves and start to pressure the idiot government we have in power here right now to stop risking Armageddon for all of us. We don't want or need Armageddon. We don't need to have a United States which is in a position of hegemony with respect to the rest of the world. We need a United States that is a collaborator in a multipolar world. We need a United States which stops trying to provoke regime change in various countries around the world, including, of course, in Russia, but also in Venezuela. The latest intervention in the elections in Venezuela were particularly shameful, but the regime change operations in other areas of the world are awful as well and must stop. They must stop. By the way, I haven't shared this yet, so I had better do this before we go on to the next piece. Let's see what happens when I try to share this. Well, I've shared it, and that's certainly very good. It means that Facebook has decided not to block this as yet. That will be novel. Well, so let me go on to our second piece of the evening. By the way, Steve Wolfbrandt is here. Hi, Steve. And Lana's here. Hi, Lana. And Catherine, of course, is here. Catherine said, but I did pill almost 15% of the vote as an independent in a four-way race. Pretty good. Yeah, pretty good. 15% of the vote is pretty good, Catherine. It's encouraging. And I'll bet you did that with almost no money at all, right? Yes. That's the way. It would have been a lot more than 15% if you could have gotten even a modicum of financial support. Well, only a nationwide dump the corruption campaign is going to enable that. Hi, Evelina, and hi, Brandy, and hi, Dee. Nice to see you all here. So let's go to our second piece of the evening, which, of course, is about our common friend, Scott Ritter. And not that I know Scott, he's not my friend in that way. But nevertheless, he is a friend of all of us who care about the survival of the world. You know by this time that there was a video, that there was an FBI raid on Scott Ritter's house. They walked out with boxes and boxes of stuff. But here's a video response to the FBI raid on his house. There's a copy of the search warrant there also, but I'm going to play the video now. Hopefully it will play.
It is my intention to write a very detailed article about the FBI raid on my house yesterday and have it published in my Substack. And this is just a quick public announcement. Please, if you haven't already, subscribe to my Substack. You can do so for free, or you can choose a paid subscription. For those of you out there who say, well, how can we at this time, anticipating the potential need for additional resources because of the FBI raid, a paid subscription to my Substack would be of great assistance, but it's not necessary. You can get an unpaid subscription and have
Sorry for the buffer.
total access to the material, including the article I'm planning on writing. I was hoping to write it in time to have it published so that we could have it discussed in depth on the Friday night edition of Ask the Inspector. Unfortunately, without a computer, that makes it pretty tough. And
Yep, they took his computer.
FBI's got my computer right now. So what I'm going to do instead is just provide a brief narrative through video.
Sorry about the buffering. It's too much. It seems like I cannot share this, even though I would love to. So I'm not sure why the buffering is there. I have plenty of memory space and CPU capacity available, but obviously this is not going to work. So I'm going to remove this. But the next thing we have goes into the incident in some detail. So I'm going to share the screen with that. It's it's a piece by Phil Giraldo. He is former CIA as well. Okay, this article was also in UNS, the UNS Review. It said there is something rotten in Washington. Scott Ritter is harassed by the FBI for calling for peace, while Israel's the lobby overthrows elections. This piece was done on August 8th, 2024. It's quite long. That's also quite good. Here's a picture of Scott. One thing you can say about the administration of President Joe Biden is that nearly every week there is something new and exciting to discuss. Galloping Dementia recently gifted us with Joe's 11-minute abdication speech, in which he announced that he would not be running for another term as president. He babbled about how he was taking the step in spite of his desire to continue. The president, who was 81 and recently best noted for his failing mental state, causing him to fall downstairs, felt compelled to say that he believes that his record as a president, quote, merited a second term, unquote, but that, quote, nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy, unquote. He also claimed that, quote, I'm the first president in this country to report to the American people that the United States is not at war anywhere in the world, even though it is engaged in a military occupation and combat operations in Syria, bombing Yemen, and conducting counterterrorism in Iraq, as well as supporting logistically and with intelligence the large and growing conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza. This is not to mention the interference in the election in Venezuela by the United States, where we have been supporting people who are mightily trying to overturn the results of that election and get rid of Nicolas Maduro as the president, of Venezuela. Going on with the article. He has pledged to Israel that he will, quote, defend, unquote, it if attacked. Presumably, no matter what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu assassinates or bombs to provoke a war against Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. Joe ended up by celebrating a nomination of Kamala Harris as heir designate to the Oval Office after disposing of the troublesome and assertive Donald Trump, who presumably is the one who will tear up the U.S. Constitution and, quote, destroy democracy, unquote, if given the chance to do so. Well, that may be a provocative paragraph, but you've got to admit it's fair. I think it's fair. It's what is going on. Pulling no punches. But that was 2 weeks ago. More recently, the fun fair on the Potomac turned its guns on a major critic of the federal government's policy, most notably exercising its proclivity to float a lot of lies to turn anyone who exercises his or her First Amendment rights to free speech into some kind of traitor who has to be silenced. Many would argue that if the Biden administration has one major failure beyond losing control over the country's southern border, it is failure to manage U.S. foreign policy in such a fashion as to avoid initiating or expanding existing international conflicts so as to turn them into major wars. If one considers Ukraine and Gaza, both conflicts that could have easily been stopped or de-escalated, if the State Department had stopped acting as a shill before Volodymyr Zelensky and Benjamin Netanyahu, and had instead created disincentives to continue the fighting. The case for U.S. involvement as an antagonist is non-existent. The American people benefit in no way from either war, and opinion polls make clear that there is considerable opposition to the carnage taking place along both fronts. On August 7th, it was reported that Scott Ritter, who I consider a friend, had his house in New York State searched by the FBI and police, and 25 boxes containing documents and electronic communications devices were reportedly taken away for examination and, quote, ongoing investigation, unquote. Scott, a former Marine Corps intelligence officer, has anti-war credentials that go way back to before the Iraq War, when he, as a United Nations weapons inspector, declared that Saddam Hussein had, quote, no weapons of mass destruction, unquote, WMD. The WMD fear was being promoted in Washington as the reason for attacking and disarming Iraq. Scott was pilloried both by the mainstream media and by the Pentagon's and White House's mostly Jewish neocons, Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, Richard Perle, and Scooter Libby, who were busy fabricating deliberately misleading information and disseminating it to encourage the George W. Bush administration to start the war, which it obligingly did. Scott, nevertheless, has continued to be an effective gadfly over war and peace issues ever since that time. Ritter had earlier had a run-in with the Biden regime in June 2024, when he was at the airport in New York City, preparing to fly to Istanbul on his way to St. Petersburg to attend the prestigious International Economic Forum that city hosts annually. A team of 3 FBI agents accosted him as he was about to board his plane, and they confiscated his passport under orders from the State Department. They would neither give him a receipt for the document, nor did they produce a warrant. No reason was given for the action, and Scott has since that time been unable to get his passport back. The passport confiscation and the house search appear to be connected with what is referred to as the Foreign Agent Registration Act, the FARA, of 1938 investigation. FARA came into being just before the outbreak of the Second World War, when it was feared that, quote, agents, unquote, of the Italian and German governments were all too freely spreading their propaganda in the United States. In particular, FARA mandates that the finances and relationships of the foreign affiliated organization be open to Department of Justice inspection. States that, quote, any person who acts as an agent, representative, employee, or servant, or otherwise acts at the order, request, or under the direction or control of a foreign principal, unquote. Those who fail to disclose might be penalized by up to 5 years in prison and fines up to $250,000. To be sure, the U.S. government has recently been aggressive in demanding FARA registration for other nations as well as for Americans working for foreign powers. There have been several prominent FARA cases in the news. Major Russian news agencies operating in the U.S. were compelled to register in 2017 because they were funded largely or in part by the Kremlin. Also, as part of their plea deals, the former Trump campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn both conceded they had failed to comply with FARA when working as consultants with foreign governments. While the Department of Justice is now going after Scott Ritter using FARA, presumably because he is an effective critic of Joe Biden's wars, there are some implications that other elements in the U.S. government security apparatus are going after others who have dared to oppose what the White House and Congress have been up to. On August the 6th, while Democratic nominee Kamala Harris pledged to defend, quote, freedom, compassion, and the rule of law, unquote, to cheers in Philadelphia, Hawaii's former Congresswoman and National Guard officer Tulsi Gabbard described how she was being tracked by teams of government agents and surveilling her and her husband whenever she travels by air. Whistleblowing air marshals leaked how Gabbard had been singled out as a, quote, domestic terror threat, unquote, under the so-called, quote, quiet skies, unquote, program. Her boarding passes bear the SSSS notation, which makes her subject to additional security searches and questioning. Her probable crime is opposing the war in Ukraine, or having recently published a book entitled, quote, For Love of Country, Leave the Democratic Party Behind, unquote. While Attorney General Merrick Garland is active in pursuing individual Americans for possible FARA and, quote, domestic terrorism violations, he is strangely but predictably reluctant to go after the most corrupt foreign government's U.S. domestic lobby, which dwarfs all others in terms of illicit cash flow and political impact. It is a foreign government that receives billions of dollars a year in, quote, aid, unquote, and other benefits from the United States taxpayer. Well, of course, we don't believe it's from the taxpayer, but that's another issue. Consider beyond that the possibility that that government might take part of the money it receives and secretly recycle it to groups of American citizens in the United States that exist to maintain and increase that money flow, while also otherwise serving other interests of the recipient country. And that would mean that the United States is itself subsidizing the lobbies and groups that are inevitably working against its own interests. It also means those lobbyists, though U.S. citizens, are acting as foreign agents, covertly giving priority to their attachment to a foreign country instead of to the nation in which they live. I guess I have to add here that I don't know that any subsidies are really needed for these groups because they are the recipients of huge amounts of money from wealthy billionaires here in the United States who have a great affection for the regime, okay, in Israel. Now, of course, they will claim their affection is for Israel, and not for the regime. But of course, they keep advocating or keep trying to use their money to block people who would stop the flow of arms and weapons to the genocidal regime, okay, in Israel. They somehow think these people, these very, very rich billionaires seem to think that this kind of action is appropriate despite the genocide that it is giving rise to. I am, of course, says Phil Giraldi, referring to Israel. It does not require a brilliant observer to note how Israel and its allies inside the U.S. become very skilled at milking the government of the United States at all levels for every bit of financial aid, trade concessions, and also military hardware and political cover that it is possible to obtain. The flow of dollars, goods, and protection is never actually debated in any serious way and is often, in fact, negotiated directly by Congress or state legislatures directly with the Israeli lobbyists. This corruption and manipulation of the U.S. government system by people who are basically foreign agents is something like a criminal enterprise, and one can only imagine the screams of outrage coming from the New York Times if there were a similar arrangement with any other country. Recent revelations suggest that Israel's cheating involves subsidies that are paid covertly by Israeli government agencies to group in the United States, which in turn took direction from the Jewish state, often inter alia damaging genuine American interests. The Israeli lobby also has been long noted for its interference in American elections, including spending large sums of money to oust politicians who complain about the Jewish state and its behavior. Progressive Congresswoman Cori Bush, a critic of Israel, was recently ousted after her opponent received $8 million. I believe that figure is $9 million. And earlier this year, Jamal Bowman lost after a record $15 million went to support another, quote, friendly to Israel, unquote, candidate. Many of the groups receiving Israeli money failed to disclose the payments, which is a felony. At the same time, even the casual observer of government in Washington would inevitably note how Israel's various friends and proxies uniquely have been de facto exempt from any regulation by the U.S. government. The last serious attempt to register a major lobbying entity was made by John F. Kennedy, who sought to have the predecessor organization to today's American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, comply with FARA. Kennedy was killed before he could complete the process, and some have linked his deaths to efforts to register the Israel lobby elements, while also blocking Israeli attempts to illegally and secretly develop nuclear weapons. If one is requiring all the Israeli proxies that together make up the Israel lobby to register under FARA, you might start with AIPAC, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, but there will be many, many more before the work is done, and there is Christians United for Israel, CUFI, which has also received funding and material aid directly from Israel. The fundamentalist Christian head cases that place Israel's interests ahead of those of their own country finally need to have their bell rung. One might well suggest that the Biden administration stop harassing ordinary Americans who are exercising their free speech right to critique unnecessary wars and instead go after the Israel lobby, which is a major contributing factor to why those wars are taking place. It would also be nice to end the hypocrisy that surrounds anything having to do with Israel and Washington. The country is no democracy, no ally, and it is a major league war criminal with possibly hundreds of thousands of dead Palestinians, and as evidence of its genocidal inclinations. Several hundred congressmen cheering war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu do not change that. Apart from anything else that the United States is involved in, sustaining and providing cover for the slaughter of thousands of innocents while also pursuing its own citizens who are saying, quote, thou shalt not, unquote, is an abomination. Again, this piece was written by Philip M. Giraldi, PhD. He's the executive director of the Council for the National Interest, a 501c3 tax-deductible educational foundation, federal ID number #52-1739023, that seeks a more interest-based U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. He's also a former member of the CIA. I just add that myself. Website is councilforthenationalinterest.org. Address is P.O. Box 2157, Purcellville, Virginia. And its email is inform@cnionline.org. By the way, Purcellville just happens to be in my area. It must be maybe 20 miles from here, perhaps even less. So perhaps I'll try to arrange for lunch with Phil Giraldi. This was certainly a terrific piece. I think very accurate, in its judgments. I think the comparison between what's happening to Scott Ritter and the way the government is treating, comparison of the way the government treats Israel and its agents here in this country, and the way the government is treating people like Scott Ritter, in Tulsi Gabbard, is highly illustrative of unfair treatment. Not just unfair treatment, but of course Americans are supposed to be treated equally under the law. We are not getting equal treatment here. We are getting selective prosecutions or selective investigations, while the partisans of a particular foreign nation are getting a free ride. No one investigates them. No one in any way threatens to indict them in spite of their impossibly close ties with Israel. It's just incredible. They're handmaidens of Israeli foreign policy, and they get absolutely no static from either the State Department or the Department of Justice, while people who are trying to arrange for peaceful solutions to international problems are exposed to intimidation by the federal government and to attempts to stifle their speech and their activities to shape the opinions of the American public. It's disgusting. It's something we should not be tolerating. We need to call for the prosecution of those Americans who are receiving subsidies from Israel, in any way, or who are taking directives from Israel, in any way. Going on. So I'll take a few comments here. Brandy says, "Hi, Joe, not feeling good, but listening while I'm lying down. I'll hope you feel better very shortly, Brandy." Catherine says, "Hello, unfortunately, I did not make it through my primary." Steve Volkman says, "Hello, everybody." Lana says, "Hi, folks, shared." Catherine says, "I did pull almost 15% of the vote." Dee greets everybody. Evelina Pont waves. And Brandy says, "Hi, Dee. Hi, Brandy." Branch saw it go live on Facebook. It came over to YouTube. It's always safer on YouTube. Steve says, "Smash the like button." John B. says, "Giraldi should expect a visit soon from the FBI. He'd better ensure he backs up his essential data to an off-site secure location. And he also better have a backup computer, which is not on his site, which is off-site itself. So he needs to do that. Otherwise, he'll be shut down the way Scott has been shut down. I think Scott is probably going to be needing considerable financial support soon. There's a piece by Larry Johnson out where he says that he thought Scott was being very naive in being highly cooperative, with the FBI, taking the position that he had nothing to hide, and that he thinks that the twin activities of taking his passport and now the search of his house signal that the FBI is not approaching this situation in good faith, at all, and that they intend to try to build a case against Scott, under FARA, so that if Scott intends to survive this, he has to try to defend himself. He has to have a lawyer he can count on, and he has to have sources of funds that will stop him from going bankrupt, in the attempt to defend himself. So I just thought that needed to be said. Let's go on to another thing, the final topic of tonight, which is Israel's disaster. And it'll be very interesting for you to find out what this is, but it's the disaster of Israel's foreign policy, basically. Well, not just foreign policy, but also policy with respect to the occupied territory since 1967. So, title of this article, which I picked up at Portside, but it's from the Atlantic originally, is called Israel's Disaster Foretold, and the subtitle is the ICJ's, that's the International Court of Justice's, opinion on the West Bank is devastating, and it isn't wrong. This is written by Gershom Gorenberg, who is an Israeli, of course. Well, I shouldn't say of course, it's possible he's not an Israeli, but in fact he is an Israeli. So that appears to be a hole in the wall somewhere. The article starts, "You can't say Israel wasn't warned." On June 19, 1967, a week after the Six-Day War, the Israeli cabinet met to discuss the future of the territories that Israel had just occupied. One proposal was to permanently keep the West Bank and give its Palestinian residents local autonomy but not citizenship. Justice Minister Yaakov Shimshon Shapira responded that in an era that, quote, end quote, an era of decolonization, the idea was absurd. Quote, "Every progressive person will rise against us and say," quote again, "they want to turn the West Bank inhabited by Arabs into a colony," unquote, he said. 3 months later, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol was preparing to green light the first Israeli settlement in the West Bank. A top aide checked with the Foreign Ministry's legal advisor, Theodore Meron, about the legality of the move. "My conclusion, quote unquote," he answered in the top secret memo, quote again, "is that civilian settlement in the administered occupied territories contravenes explicit provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention," unquote. In other words, it was illegal. Specifically, Meron, who go on to become one of the world's leading authorities on the laws of war, cited the last paragraph of Article 49 of the Convention. Quote, "The occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies," unquote. Fast forward to this summer, at The Hague, the the president of the International Court of Justice, Nawaf Salam, read out the tribunal's opinion on the legality of the Israeli occupation on a Friday afternoon, timing that guaranteed there was minimal coverage because journalists would already be leaning into the weekend. He spoke in the rhythmic monotone peculiar to judges declaiming long printed judgments, but his words were dramatic, indeed scathing. The ICJ had concluded, the International Court of Justice had concluded, that Israel, behind the facade of a temporary occupation, has developed permanent control of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. The settlements are one part of that particular metamorphosis. Therefore, Israel has violated the post-World War II ban on acquiring territory by force, and it has, quote, frustrated the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, unquote. And so, quote, Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful, unquote, and should end. Other countries must avoid recognizing Israeli annexation of any territory taken in 1967, including East Jerusalem. As an Israeli, I am devastated by the indictment of 57 years of my country's policy and actions in the occupied territories. As someone who has reported extensively on those actions, I also know that the opinion is almost entirely on target. The administration is advisory and not binding. It does not obligate Israel or any other country to act. The United Nations Security Council decision based on that ruling would be necessary for that. Yet it's a watershed. That Israel is breaking the law is now the position of the highest tribunal for international disputes. The ruling could spur individual countries, including traditional allies of Israel, to take actions, such as imposing newer and wider sanctions against individual settlers, settlement organizations, and even Israeli government officials. Britain is reportedly weighing ending some arms sales to Israel because of the ICJ opinion. Note that despite the timing, the opinion isn't connected to the current war in Gaza, and the court did not regard its mandate as covering the aftermath of October 7th. That is because the ICJ was responding to a request by the UN General Assembly in December 2022. Gaza is mentioned because Israel continued to exercise some authority over that territory after its 2005 withdrawal, for instance, by controlling Gaza's airspace and offshore waters. More important, Gaza shows up in the 83-page opinion because the ICJ defines the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza as a single territory, and as the realm in which Palestinians have the right to self-determination. Given the tide of recent anti-Israel activism in the West, this point is worth stressing. The ICJ opinion takes the legitimacy of Israel within its pre-1967 borders as a given. It provides no sustenance to those who regard all Israelis as settlers, or call for a Palestinian state, quote, from the river to the sea, unquote. Explicitly, the court affirms that recognizing a Palestinian state next to Israel is the way to end the conflict. An Israeli government eager to reach a two-state agreement, a government utterly different from the current one, in other words, could find at least a few sparks of light in the opinion. The key to the ICJ's logic is this: the military occupation of land beyond one's borders can be legal if it is a military necessity, but it is supposed to be temporary. Under post-World War II international law, you are not allowed to access your conquests. The occupied must administer the territory for the benefit of the local population. Temporary, however, is an undefined slippery term. Imagine an alternative world in which Israel conquered the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, and then heeded those early warnings. It left local laws in place, didn't settle Israelis on occupied land, and treated the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention as holy writ. Let's say that Israel tried to reach peace with the Palestinians, but an agreement never came together. over the refugee issue or access to holy places or security arrangements or Palestinian cold feet about ending the conflict. 57 years later, Israel could still be a legal occupier. But we don't live in that world. Though the court does not mention this, actual history diverged from that scenario on the first night after the ceasefire in 1967. An Israeli lieutenant colonel oversaw the bulldozing of the Arab neighborhood next to the Western Wall in Jerusalem's Old City to create space for crowds next to the Jewish holy site. In those first post-war hours, Israel seized real estate and occupied lands for its own use and forcibly displaced the residents. Both actions were violations of international law that the ICJ does describe in more general terms. Within 3 weeks, the Knesset passed laws allowing the government to expand the city limits of Israeli Jerusalem to encompass the Old City and an additional swath of occupied land and to extend Israeli law to those areas. In the hope of reducing international objections, Israel insisted this wasn't annexation, just a local municipal change. But as the ICJ points out, the Geneva Convention forbids changing local laws and institutions in occupied territory. And the Knesset's passage of a 1980 law formally declaring the united, complete, unquote, city to be Israel's capital made annexation explicit and removed any remaining rules of temporary occupation in East Jerusalem. Despite the warning, of Maron, the first civilian settlement in the West Bank was established in September 1967 in what was known as the Etzion Block between Bethlehem and Hebron. The Etzion Block had been the site of 4 kibbutzim, which were conquered by Transjordanian and local Arab forces on the eve of Israel's establishment in May 1948. In his memo, Theodore Meron wrote that establishing a settlement there would nonetheless be seen internationally as violating the Fourth Geneva Convention. So this move to involved a pretense as a, quote, cover, unquote, for the purposes of the diplomatic struggle, says a long classified Israel Defense Forces document. The settlement was identified as a military outpost, permissible for an occupying power. In fact, the memo confirms the settlement had no connection to the army. As the number of settlements grew and maintaining the cover, quote unquote, became impossible, the government switched tactics. It relied on the arguments of 2 prominent Israeli jurists who said that the Fourth Geneva Convention did not apply to the West Bank. That claim gained almost no support from legal experts abroad. Meanwhile, the West Bank remained under the direct rule of the IDF, subject to a mix of the pre-1967 legal system and Israeli military laws. The right-wing Likud party took power in 1977 and stepped up settlement building. Government financial centers drew Israelis to new suburbs in occupied territory. But what laws would apply to them there? The military orders in 1979 enabled the commander of the West Bank to set up Israeli-style local governments or settlements, whereas Israeli laws would apply solely within the municipal limits. 1995 Oslo Accords with the Palestinians were supposed to lead to a final status agreement that would decide the fate of the settlements. After Oslo, the Israeli government stepped up road building to settlements so that settlers could avoid driving through towns now administered by the new Palestinian Authority. No final status agreement was ever reached, and the web of roads kept growing. Today, the roads serve to ease the commute to settlements. In illustration, my home in West Jerusalem is near a main thoroughfare. Less than a mile to the south, at a spot marked neither on official maps nor on the road itself, it crosses the pre-1967 border. Take a quick right and then left at a pair of traffic lights, and you'll be on a highway that passes through 2 tunnels through the mountains to take you to the Etzion block of settlements. Settlers living there vote in Israeli elections, are covered by Israeli national health insurance, and in nearly every respect live as if they were inside Israel. None of that applies to Palestinian communities near the same highway. So when the ICJ opinion states that, quote, for all intents and purposes, unquote, Israel has annexed parts of the West Bank, quote again, while hiding behind a fiction, unquote, of temporary occupation. It is describing the uncomfortable truth. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's current government makes very little effort to maintain that fiction. The ruling coalition depends on two far-right parties, both led by settlers. One of those leaders, the religious Zionist parties, Bezalel, Smotrich, has a double portfolio as finance minister and as a minister within the defense ministry. In the latter role, he was given control over planning and construction in the West Bank. Those powers previously belonged to the military. Handing them to a civilian dispensed with the cover of military occupation, bringing Israel closer, as the ICJ points out, to asserting explicit sovereignty in the West Bank, which is to say permanent control. Permanent is also a slippery term. The ICJ's operative conclusions are that virtually everything Israel has done, its settlements, its legislation, its expropriations, and more, should be treated as impermanent and reversible. Some of this is doable, albeit only by an utterly different Israeli government. To start, the court says, Israel must immediately cease all new settlement activity, quote unquote. But then it goes on to say that Israel should evacuate, quote, all existing settlements, which is less pervasive and less likely. Previous rounds of Palestinian negotiations, even if unsuccessful, developed the idea of land swaps. Israel would retain some large settlements close to the pre-1967 border and cede some of its own sovereign territory to the new Palestinian state in exchange. The simpler reason to pursue this is that it would make a two-state agreement easier to reach and carry out. The headline finding in the ICJ opinion is that Israel must, quote, end its presence, unquote, in occupied territory, quote again, as rapidly as possible, unquote. This sounds logical and attractive. I'd like to see the occupation end tonight if it could happen safely. But as a dissent by three of the court's judges argues, a reality outside the frame of the majority opinion complicates such demands. By any measure, Israel, quote, faces serious security threats, unquote. I'm not sure what this, there's an insertion here of a link. Okay, this is from Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib. I think it's just a citation to support the previous point. Israel killed my family, okay, but not my hope. I'm not sure what that article says, and I won't go into it, but it may support the idea that Israel faces serious security threats. Put differently, the majority of the court is treating the West Bank and Gaza as a colony that Israel should simply give up. But unlike France and Algeria or Portugal and Mozambique, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories border each other, and within those territories are armed and popular Palestinian groups that lay claim to all of Israel. Hamas has shown no sign that it would give up that claim and lay down its arms if Israel would simply leave both Gaza and the West Bank. Building a Palestinian state capable of living peacefully next to Israel requires Palestinian political change, which in turn requires a level of international and especially American involvement that has been lacking in recent years. It requires not just Palestinian willingness to sign off on the end of the conflict, but also a Palestinian government ready and able to disarm all armed groups within its borders. It may require foreign peacekeeping forces like those deployed in the Sinai after the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement. These are not developments likely to happen overnight. I think here he's being somewhat biased because I think the same thing applies to uh, um, um, the Israelis. In any two-state settlement, most probably the settlers in the West Bank would have to be taken into Israel. And if they were taken into Israel, then of course it would also be necessary for the government of Israel be willing to disarm those particular settlers, because Israel would also have to disarm, in order to be completely fair about this, all of the armed groups within its borders. In other words, if you're going to require that of the Palestinians, you have to require that of the Israelis as well. Uh, the Israeli government predictably rejected the opinion the Jewish nation, quote, is not an occupier in its own homeland, unquote. A cabinet resolution proclaimed. On the surface, this statement seemed to brush off the legal case, but it subtly pointed to the need for an international legal framework. Not so sure that pointing was that subtle. Without an international legal framework, the Israelis would still consider the parts of Palestine that afford the self-determination of the Palestinians to still be their homeland. That is not an acceptable position from the standpoint of the Palestinians. The Israelis have to give up the idea that they are not an occupier in their homeland. They are an occupier in the Palestinian homeland. Until they recognize that, there can't be a two-state solution. Almost the entire stretch of land, going on with Gersham's article, almost the entire stretch of land extending from the Baltic Sea to the Red Sea belonged to empires until the late 19th century. The crumbling of the empires and their collapse during World War I led to the creation of nation states based on the principle of self-determination. But the historic lands of the nationalities overlap, like the circles of Venn diagram. Hungary can claim that part of its homeland is now in Romania. Turkey and Greece could each claim part of the other's territory on historic grounds. And Jews and Palestinians can each rightfully claim the same narrow land, as their own. I don't know about that, because, of course, the Jews, though there were always some Jews in Palestine, the main population of Jews arrived very late, in the game. And so I'm not sure that their claim to the same narrow land as their own is quite as strong as the Palestinians' claim. In other words, you have to believe, you have to go back to 2,000 years ago, to establish the historic claim of the Jews into the same, narrow land. By itself, self-determination is a formula for an unending war. The ban on acquiring territory by force is meant to prevent this. It bars Israel from annexing the West Bank and Gaza. For the same reason, Palestinian self-determination must be limited to those territories. The ICJ opinion describes 57 years of a disastrous Israeli policy. Ultimately, it could help to bring about positive change by pushing other countries to re-engage with the effort to bring Israeli and Palestinians to a two-state agreement, or by serving as a warning to Israel to reverse course. For the moment, however, the ruling is just one more reminder that Israel needs a government capable of hearing that warning, okay, at last. I don't completely agree with this article, of course, and I've stated some grounds of disagreement. In particular, I'm not sure the claims to the land, of the Israelis, and the Palestinians, are of equal merit from a historic standpoint. In fact, I don't think they are of equal merit from a historic standpoint. However, the Israelis do have a claim in that they are there and they are very well armed. And that's a reality that has to be taken account of. And even if the Israelis were to be weakened, in a war, or even very seriously damaged, inside a war, their possession, of nuclear weapons, and still a considerable amount of force, would of course buttress their claim to have a state, in that area. So I think the basis for a settlement still has to go back to the events of 1947, when the UN partitioned, the area and envisioned two states. I think the problem has been the frustration of the self-determination of the Palestinians continuously by the Israelis from 1947 on, and accelerating after the victories in 1967. Thanks. So, I think the labeling of what Israel has wrought, a disaster, is certainly correct. It's a disaster because of all the conflicts and all the sorrows that have been visited upon the inhabitants of that nation over a period of time. It is a disaster in particular because of the genocide that is going on there today. That has to be stopped. It just has to be stopped. But also the idea, that this disaster was foretold. It was foretold. There were many people who in the 1960s and early 70s knew that the course of Israeli policies that was building up the settlements was in effect implementing a disaster that sooner or later would befall the people of the area, both the Palestinians and also the Israelis. And I believe, the Israelis are on the point, on the point of experiencing a very serious disaster themselves. I mean, I think that we are, we won't know, we'll know more after the retaliation, of the Iranians. We'll know more after we see whether that leads to further escalation. Yes, we will know more about that. But it looks like this disaster is likely to grow and grow and grow. But certainly the genocide, that is a disaster that the area will not recover from for many years. And that is already in a state, of implementation. That must stop. any further violence in the area is just going to add to the disaster. The Israeli attempt to maintain their hegemony over all of Palestine and even to extend it into other countries, that is a huge disaster also. So I have some more comments, at least one more comment. John B. says, very sad state of affairs now exists in the U.S. Honest, decent citizens have been betrayed by the elites. I completely agree, and continue to be betrayed by the elites. There's no question about it. There's no question about it. The whole process by which Joe Biden has been replaced by Harris, okay, that whole process was very undemocratic. But that was not the first of the undemocratic processes. The process involving the nomination of Joe Biden for a second term was very undemocratic, rigged, highly manipulative. If there had been real primaries, Joe Biden would not have been renominated. Had there been a normal primary process, if there had been debates in the early stages of the primary, the incapacity of Joe Biden would have been revealed very, very early. If that kind of primary had been held as it went forward, and as the incapacity of Joe Biden was more and more seen, it might have resulted in the resignation of Joe Biden from the presidency. And Kamala Harris might have taken over as the president, and she still hasn't actually taken over from the president. We're still operating with the fiction that Joe Biden can handle the presidency. But certainly the gift of the nomination to Harris was a highly undemocratic process, which was brokered by the elites of the Democratic Party. Over the years, they got used to managing things and to not allowing things happen from the bottom up. They've destroyed true democracy from the inside of the Democratic Party. And so the citizens of the United States have had very, very little input into our foreign policy. Now, normally the citizens have very, very little input into foreign policy. But judging by the protests and demonstrations over months now, citizens want a voice in foreign policy and want to say in foreign policy, and the elites are preventing that. And the result of the decisions made by the elites have not been good. The Ukraine interventions have been a disaster. Policy towards Ukraine has been a disaster. The unblinking, continuing support of the Israelis in their commission of genocide, that's a disaster that this country won't live down for many, many years. Yes, our elites have betrayed us. They've betrayed us by helping to transform also the electoral system of the United States into one that is dominated by donors. We all know how that happened. We all know that it has to stop. I have some pills to take right now. I'll take them and await any more comments you might have. But in the absence of any other comments, I think I am done for the night. And I will see you again on Tuesday. On this Tuesday, I will probably be covering more developments in the international sphere, because by Tuesday, I think we will probably have the Iranians making their move, and there will be that, okay, to discuss. And then later next week, I'll be doing Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday next week again. On Thursday, I'll probably be discussing the progress of the election, okay, in the United States and what's happening there. So Lana says good night. Good night, Lana. Thank you very much for coming. And thanks to all of you who have been here, those who have commented and those who are unannounced. Thank you very much for being here. And I will see you again on Tuesday.